So fans and people who cover Notre Dame in college football talk a lot about how Notre Dame has to close the gap with the truly elite teams in college football in order to start competing for national championships. But just how big is that gap? The answer coming up next.
You are Locked On Irish, your daily podcast on the Notre Dame Fighting Irish. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's going on, and welcome to Locked On Irish. It is Monday, April 17th, and thank you for getting your week started here and making this your first listen of the day. The show is free and available on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts, so whether you're watching or listening, please take a moment to subscribe to the show if you haven't already. My name is Tyler Wojciak, and I am the host. I'm a Notre Dame alum and producer for college football talent at Fox Sports, and this episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, the official sportsbook of Locked On. Make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn today to get started. And in today's episode, I'm going to be joined by Jamie Uyeyama from Irish Sports Daily to discuss what it takes to win a national championship in the college football playoff era. Jamie went back and analyzed all the teams who have done so since 2014 when the college football playoff started, and he found some consistencies that I thought were really interesting. And then we discussed how far Notre Dame is from those teams today and what it's going to take in order for the Irish to get back to competing at a national championship level. For the everyday listeners of the pod, or the everydayers as we're calling you here at the Locked On Podcast Network, be sure to tune in to tomorrow's episode for the latest updates out of Notre Dame spring practice. We got to hear from head coach Marcus Freeman over the weekend, as well as both coordinators, and there's a bunch of interesting things coming out of Notre Dame's practice on Saturday that I want to discuss that I'll get to on Tuesday's show. Okay, let's welcome in Jamie. All right, I'm joined now by Jamie Uyeyama from Irish Sports Daily, and let's get right into it. You went back and analyzed every national championship team in the college football playoff era to try and figure out what it takes to win it all. And you said in your article that you have to be very talented at every position, but overall, what are some of the three most important things that every championship team has had?
I think you got to be great, really, on offense and defense, and in specific areas, I would say you got to be explosive on offense. You have to be explosive. You have to be able to create explosive plays. I think that's number one. You have to be basically top 15 in explosive passing plays. You have to have an explosive passing game. And that kind of goes hand in hand with the skill position talent that you have and the quarterback that you need. And really, if you look at the list of quarterbacks, there's one big outlier in Jake Coker, who was on Alabama, right? The 2017 Alabama team that won the national championship. But even he was 31st in passer rating that year. So he was obviously above average, but the team was loaded, right? They were loaded around him. He was surrounded by multiple first round picks.
Derrick Henry, just one of them.
Yeah. Right. And they had the number one defense in DF plus, which is the combined FEI and SP plus ranking. So you kind of need that on offense. You need the quarterback and you need the skill position guys, because you have to be explosive. So that automatically right there is number one, right? And I just think overall level of talent on your roster, you have to have multiple first round picks, right? So it's not even just to say you have NFL talent. And so the 2018 Notre Dame team, for example, which was loaded with talent and had a ton of NFL draft picks, right? And if you go back and look at it, it was easily the most talented team that Notre Dame has had in quite some time. And I'd say even if you look at compared to that 2012 team, which is very talented as well, there's more depth of talent in that 2018 team overall. When you look at say defensive line rotation, there were NFL guys who were backups, right? So, but when you look at that compared to everyone else, it's they had Claypool and they had Boykin at receiver. Well, they didn't have a first round guy, right? They didn't have a first round guy. They didn't, even though Ian Book was a very good quarterback for Notre Dame, obviously won a ton of games, won the most games in Notre Dame history. He would be the second worst quarterback to win in the college football playoff era. And he didn't have Alabama's overall talent surrounding him like Jacob Coker did, right? So just overall depth of talent at every positions, right? Because you got to just have multiple first round picks just kind of sprinkled throughout the roster, and just NFL picks throughout the entire roster, right? And so that obviously those things stand out. And then I think you have to be at a certain level on the offensive and defensive line. And really like defensive line, yeah, we're talking about like NFL level talent again. That 2018 defensive line, that was a championship caliber defensive line for Notre Dame, right? That's the reason that they probably were as good as they were really for that 2018 and 2019 seasons, because they had so much talent, right? Like the fact that they could lose, like say Dalen Hayes and Julian Okwara, and then it was like, oh well, now Ade Ogundeji and Jameer Jones are going to play, and they're going to be on third down, and it's like there wasn't a drop off because these guys were also good guys who played in the NFL, who play in the NFL, right? So you need that up front on the defensive line, but then you have to be like a Joe Moore award-esque line, right? You need to be that kind of level. That's what it kind of takes to get to that level up front too. And everyone except for the 2016 Clemson team, which is like kind of like the outlier in all of this, everyone was at the bare minimum a semifinalist for the Joe Moore Award, and most of them were finalists, right? And some of them actually won the award, right? So you need to be that good as a unit. So it's like when you start stacking it up, it's like, oh, well, you need this. It's like you just really need it all, right? You need it all because it's one thing where I think Notre Dame fans have this thought, or they've had this thought, and I don't know if you've seen it, Tyler, but I've seen it for many years now, where Notre Dame fans, there's a faction of people that think, nah, Notre Dame's a quarterback away. If they could just get their Trevor Lawrence, if they could just get, and it's not to say that wouldn't make a big difference and they wouldn't be better, but what it probably does is get them to maybe the championship, but probably not win it, because you got to beat Georgia, you got to beat Alabama, and they have all of that and more.
Right. And just that statement alone is kind of absurd. Like Notre Dame is one Trevor Lawrence away. Like you're one generational quarterback away from being a national championship caliber team. There's a lot from that I want to get to, especially about the line of scrimmage. But you brought up the explosive passing game first, and I thought that was really interesting because to me, it kind of reminds me of like modern baseball now, where you have to be able to hit the home run in order to have any chance of winning it all, especially in the playoffs, because you can't really string together a bunch of singles against playoff caliber pitchers. Like it's too hard. So you need to be able to make up for that and just hit them on a big play. So I think that goes into a bigger question about the quarterbacks, because it's easy to say, yeah, you need to have a great quarterback to win at the college football playoff level. But looking beyond just explosive plays, what kind of output do you need from your quarterback to have a championship level offense?
Well, essentially you need a guy who is one of the top guys. Like he has to be like, in terms of like passer rating or passing efficiency, he needs to be like a top 10 level quarterback in college football. And that's the kind of thing when you look at like a Sam Hartman, and that's why people were excited about Sam Hartman. You know, he has that kind of potential to do that, right? He has that kind of potential. He's put up those kind of numbers where he's at that kind of level there, right? So he could, potentially be that, right? Like he was 15th in pass rating last season. So if you think that he's going to get better, which could happen, right? It could definitely happen. And, that you would assume he's going to play with better talent at Notre Dame and all this kind of stuff too. Top 10 isn't like crazy, but for instance, people think Stetson Bennett, another guy that people kind of assume, if you didn't really watch them closely, you would think, oh, because this whole story, he's a former walk-on, he's kind of a skinny guy, is he going to get drafted in the NFL, whatever? And he's not Trevor Lawrence, he's not Joe Burrow, he's not Tua Tagovailoa, he's not Jalen Hurts, whatever. He's not going to be this top draft pick. He's probably going to be like a mid-round pick or whatever, if he goes at all. I mean, who knows, right? But he was 4th and 11th in passer rating, right? Like that's kind of where you need to be. So you can say, yeah, he's surrounded with all this talent. He still played really well. Obviously, they had a great offensive coordinator. Like they had everything, the pieces around him that helped him, but he still had to play at a very high level. You have to play at an extremely high level. And it's just, the amount of guys that are there, it's just like, JT Barrett, right, who was the quarterback for Ohio State in that first year, right, when they won in 2014, and then it was Cardale Jones who took over for him, right?
Yeah.
But JT Barrett, so you look at where they were the whole year, he was second in the country in pass efficiency, and I believe he was a redshirt freshman that year. But like, so you got to be like that good on offense. You have to, your quarterback has to be kind of that good. And then even Cardale Jones, who you think, oh, whatever, like, yeah, I mean, he still was a 3rd round pick, right? A guy who really didn't even play that much, right? So he obviously had a ton of raw talent, right? So that's kind of where you need to be. So whether it's Sam Hartman, whether it's Tyler Buckner, it's going to be CJ Carr in the future, Kenny Minchie, Steve Angeli, whatever. You got to play at that certain type of level. You have to be that productive, right? Like, I don't think you can just say, like, it's easy to just say 3,500 yards or this or that, but because there's plenty of different ways to skin a cat and how you're going to put up the numbers that you do, but you just have to be at a certain level. And it's got to be in an elite level.
Grand slams, no-hitters, and double plays are back, and there's no better place to get in on the MLB action than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. That's because right now, new customers can step up to the plate with a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. Just go to FanDuel.com/lockedon to sign up, place your first bet, and get up to $1,000 back in bonus bets if you don't win. Don't miss your chance to get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000 when you join FanDuel today. Just go to FanDuel.com/lockedon to sign up. FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. And as for the guys, the quarterbacks giving the ball to, the running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends, obviously you need NFL caliber dudes getting the ball. But when you were going back and looking at it, on average, like how many future NFL guys, maybe not just NFL, first round, second round guys, do these teams typically have at running back, wide receiver, and tight end combined?
Well, I mean, I think if you look at, there's every one of the teams, the average is 2.4 players in the first 2 rounds. So that's just what the average is, right? So
that's
obviously
the floor, basically. That's
right?
So high.
Yeah. So and obviously you look at the 2019 LSU or 2020 Alabama, and there are multiple first round picks that they have, right? So it's a completely different story for those teams, but and that bumps up the average. But like even that, say, 2016 Clemson team, which is that big outlier. Well, they had Mike Williams, right? They had Mike Williams, who was like a top 10 pick, right? And they had multiple other guys that were skill guys that were NFL players, right? And they had Deshaun Watson at quarterback, right? So they had all that too. But it wasn't like it was like Deshaun Watson completely carried them. No, well, they had a first round dude at wide receiver, and they had multiple other NFL dudes. But yeah, on average, 2.4 guys. So that's kind of where you get it, and say, like, you go back to that 2018 team again. And sorry, I'm just going to keep bringing them up because that to me is the closest that Notre Dame has been overall when you look at just type of talent all over throughout the roster. But they had Claypool and Boykin on the outside, right? And both those guys were day 2 NFL picks, right? Just forget the part where Claypool was way better in 2019 than 2018. But he obviously had the talent, right? He obviously had the talent. So that he was like a talented guy. But still, and they had a good running back in Dexter Williams. And, Ian Book. But Ian Book, you had him like when he was sophomore Ian Book.
Yeah.
Right? And even then, sophomore Ian Book, like I said, is the worst quarterback of that thing. You need more. You need Dexter Williams needs to be a second round pick, right? That's what you need him. You need Dexter Williams to be Derrick Henry or something, right? Like that's kind of where you're at compared to everyone else.
Yeah. So it sounds like, based on what you're saying, if you don't have the floor, like the average amount of future NFL guys, or really at any position, if you are missing the mark there, you have to be absolutely exceptional in something else. And you bring up that 2016 Clemson team. Like, they didn't necessarily have a Joe Moore Award-winning offensive line, but they did have one of the best quarterbacks in the generation. So that kind of like makes up for that and allows them to kind of compete at that level. And I'm glad you bring that game up because I actually watched that recently. It was on the rerun of that Clemson-Alabama game with Watson and Hurts. And I actually forgot just how good Mike Williams was. at
Oh yeah.
Clemson. Like, it was unbelievable watching that game back, and I was just like, wow, man, that team was really so good, and Watson just kept getting lit up by Alabama, and it didn't seem to matter. So you kind of get a sense of like, all right, like those are the type of guys that Notre Dame needs in order to win it all. Now, I want to switch over to the defensive side. And you mentioned this in your article, and I totally agree with you. It doesn't get mentioned enough about how critical it is to have top 10 or top talent at defensive back. And I think this might have to do with the fact that even if you have like studs playing back there, like say Keely Ringo, for example, at Georgia, he's going to be a first-round pick, probably a second round at worst. And Ohio State went at him. And I think once you get at that level, even if you have really talented dudes, like you have the offenses you're going up against are so good that you're just trying to contain them. Like, is that a good sense of what you're seeing at the defensive back position now?
Yeah, I think that's totally fair. Because even that the 2019 LSU team, which is known as the best offense of all time, nobody ever mentions that they had like 4 top 50 guys starting in their defensive backfield, right? And all those guys were NFL players, right? Many of them were high picks, right? So, yeah, you have to be able to match up, especially when you're talking about, well, all these teams have this kind of talent at the skill positions. Well, you got to cover those guys,
Right.
And if you don't have the people to cover them, then I mean, you really don't have a shot, really, right? Like, so yeah, so that when you have like Troy Pride, Julian Love, Alohi Gilman, right? 3 guys starting at the same time who are NFL. I mean, obviously that's great, but then you can see where things fall apart, where it's like Julian Love got hurt and the game fell apart for them, right? Like that's kind of where you're at if you don't have those guys. But even with Julian Love, you still got to, cover like T. Higgins and Justin Ross, right? And it's a very difficult thing to do. And you have to be able to match up. That's just the main thing. You have to be able to match up. You need that type of talent. And I would say probably right now, and I know we'll probably get into it later, but right now, if you're looking at where the defense is for Notre Dame right now, that's where they're the closest right now. Is I think they have the defensive backfield where probably can match up with a number of the top teams, because they're going to have guys, especially if Cam Hart ends up kind of getting healthy and playing back to the kind of the level that he played in 2021. And then you have Jaden Mickey, who I think is going to take and he has been taking a step from everything we've seen in the spring so far too. And on top of Benjamin Morrison and all that. And then all of a sudden you're saying, well, yeah, Notre Dame can match up with a lot of these teams.
Yeah, it seems like you basically have to have an elite quarterback just to give yourself a chance. And even then, it might not work out. Like I mentioned, Ringo, they were going after him. And that 2019 LSU team, they were going up against A.J. Terrell, a future first-round pick at corner for Clemson. And Jamar Chase just cooked him all game, really. And I was watching that going, oh my God, like his draft stock might plummet after this, but it didn't. And he's actually had a pretty solid NFL career up to this point. So that's just kind of what you're dealing with at level. Now, you've already kind of mentioned on the Notre Dame side of things, like as cornerback being a position where Notre Dame is pretty close to being championship caliber, or if not already there. What other personnel groups at Notre Dame do you think are pretty close or are already at that level to be a championship contender?
Well, I think you have to look at the offensive line, and everybody knows who follows the team closely that they got to figure out the guard situation. They got to replace 2 guards, right? But they've recruited at a level where, and Joe Rudolph is a proven enough coach in terms of what he's done in developing some guys, especially some guys who weren't really like high level recruits, into NFL talent. So I think they're going to be fine at guard there. And then when you look at, they got 2 guys. Joel is going to be probably a top 10 pick in next year's draft.
Yeah.
And Blake Fisher, if he's not a first round pick next year, he might be the year after, right? Like if he decides to stay, like he's that kind of talent. So you're going to have that kind of level up front. And the way they've always kind of recruited up front is really they're up there in terms of Georgia and Alabama, in terms of number of blue chips, right? 4 and 5 stars. Maybe not the same number of 5-star types that those guys have had, but in terms of guys that, are 4 stars and above, they're like the ratio is like, like basically like 90%, or essentially what they've what they've signed there and the offensive line. So there really is no reason why Notre Dame, especially this year, why they can't be like at the bare minimum a semifinalist for the Joe Moore Award, and probably should be a finalist, really, right? And so if you look at that, you say, I mean, that's what you need, right? That's what you need up front. But I think after that, that's when you look at where there's so many like unanswered questions about the roster in general. Like, I mean, Hartman, like we mentioned before, like, yes, he's someone who I think would be close, right? If he's the guy, if he's still acclimating to the system and all that, he's still got to win the job. Tyler Buckner's having a great spring, could win the job too, right? So whether one of those guys, I think there is the potential for one of those guys to be like a top 10 quarterback in college football. I don't think that's like outlandish to say that. But in saying that, I think like say Audric Estime, I think has a chance to be like a pretty decent high pick. Obviously, he's not going to be a first round pick. There's not too many first round backs these days, but he has a chance to be a high pick. Tight end. So what are you going to get? Is Mitchell Evans all of a sudden just going to be like that dude, right? I don't think he's going to be Michael Mayer, but is he going to be like, the next Notre Dame tight end to go in the second round and be like one of the top tight ends off the board? I think he's got that potential. We got to see it, right? We got to see it. Eli Reardon's, I think has a sky high ceiling, but we got to see it, right? Receiver, I think everybody's excited about the potential of guys like Tobias Merriweather, right? But like, I mean, he's got one catch. So, you have to see, what, where he's at in the fall. And he might take a huge step this year, but still not be at that level where you need to. Or Lorenzo Styles might have this great bounce back year, but is he going to be at that level that you need to? Jane Thomas, I think, is certainly, he's going to play in the NFL. I'm positive Jane Thomas is going to be an NFL type player, but is he this NFL type player because of like his versatility, because he can do so many things and be like this chess piece in terms of what he can do as a blocker as well as a receiver or that? Or is he going to be like, oh no, he's actually a dude who's going to be like maybe a wide receiver one? I mean, he has a lot to prove there, right? So when you look at that, I think Notre Dame has enough talent to the skill position where you're like, yeah, there could be something there. But I'd probably say it's probably more likely that they would be like 2024. And then I'd say that the same thing about the defensive line too, where I do think Notre Dame is going to be better on the defensive line this year, even though they lost, Isaiah Foskey and the Adam Nola twins. I think they have a chance to be better up front. But are they like, I mean, Riley Mills, is he going to be like, he looks like he should be in the NFL. He should be in the NFL, but he's got to play like it. He's got to play like that on a consistent basis, right? He's got to do that. Jordan Botelho, tremendous second half of the year, obviously had a great bowl game. If he's got to play at that level the entire year, right? He's got to play at that level the entire year. And then, what are you going to get at Javonte Jean-Baptiste? What are you going to get from the young guys who mostly, I think, like, guys like Junior Tuihalamaka, Josh Burnham, Aiden Gobera, right? Even Jason Onye, who I think is obviously coming on and looks fantastic this spring, but they're probably like a year away from where like you're going to be like, oh, Notre Dame's defensive line is scary. So it's kind of more set up to be a 2024 thing. And I mean, the one main thing too that we haven't really talked about is linebacker. And that's probably where you can get away with like kind of having the least amount of talent. In saying that, almost every one of these teams had like a first round pick so they had like one guy,
but all you need is one. It's not that bad. All you need is one first round pick at linebacker.
But I'm just saying you can have sorry, the name escapes me right now, the Clemson linebacker. Skalski. You can have a Skalski, right? You can have a Skalski. You can have a Ben Boulware, right? You can have Tavon Coney, fantastic college football player, unbelievable. I would say, you could make an argument he was the best linebacker, as good as Matt Teo or Jalen Smith. Someone could make an argument that he was like, oh no, Coney was better than them in college. And I would say, I don't know if I'd agree, but it'd be close. But obviously he's not an NFL guy, but you can have that kind of guy who's just this great college football player there. But you also need the other guy. You need the Roquan Smith. Right? You need You need like basically all of the guys that Georgia has had the last few years, right? You need that type on your team. And I think, I would say JD Bertrand is probably like, closer to that Coney, Ben Boulware thing. I'm not sure if he's going to have an NFL future. I think he might be like a really good college football player. And that kind of might be his ceiling, just because he doesn't have physically, he's not a guy who he's not going to like blow anyone away with his testing or anything like that. He might still play in the league, but it just doesn't mean that he's probably not going to be a high pick. It would be very shocking if he was ever a high pick. And then from there, it's like, well, is Jalen Sneed going to be that dude, or something like one of these young guys going to be that dude? And that's kind of where you're at. Like, I think, he very well could be like a first or second round pick one day, but I mean, he's got to become a starter first. There's a long process to go there.
Yeah, and a lot of the names you mentioned, they're young players who we think have a lot of potential and could make great strides this season, but the gap for them, like what they need to make up for between their freshman and say sophomore, junior year in order to get to that level is pretty extreme. Now, that's not to say that they can't get there. We're just saying that, like, hey, that's what it is, and that's why I like this article, because it became very clear, like, for Tobias Merriweather, for example, okay, we all think he's going to take a big jump this year, but is he going to take a jump going from one catch in his freshman year to pretty clear first or second round draft pick? Okay, good, because that's one, and Notre Dame needs, based on your article, about 2.4. So then they need another guy. So that's why I really like this, and I thought it was so interesting. Now, for the inverse of that, which position groups at Notre Dame are they sort of lagging behind?
Well, I mean, I think really you would say just the skill positions, because it's like they have to catch up. They don't have the depth there. I think all three of the early enrollees, I think those guys look like players, right? They look like good players. Braylon James certainly is already running with the twos. That's an exciting development, right? He could end up being a high pick one day. I mean, I don't think it would be shocking if he was a Justin Ross type of true freshman, right? So it might take him a couple years before he gets there, right? And even Jane Grace and Rico Flores, I think they're good players. They might help the team this year, but are they ever going to get to that kind of like first round pick status? I mean, I don't personally see it for either of those guys. Maybe, but probably not. So, and all those guys got a hit too, because they just don't have the depth, right? They just don't have the depth. And that's really one of the things. So, I mean, Caleb Smith, who transferred in from Virginia Tech, that was a guy who obviously put up numbers in the ACC last year. He had average over 18 yards a catch. I mean, he's not had a very good spring, right? He's not had a very good spring. He doesn't, I mean, I would say right now, it doesn't look very good for him to be a contributor for Notre Dame this year. I mean, obviously a lot of things can happen, but that's someone that, Notre Dame probably needed just for like the depth, really. Even if he wasn't a dude, he'd be like still a guy who could help, right? Or like a guy like Deion Colsey. I mean, Notre Dame had that run where they had EQ, Equinemius St. Brown, they had Miles Boykin, they had Chase Claypool 3 years in a row, right? Where they had, or basically 4 years in a row.
Yeah, and even before that, they had Will Fuller. Like Notre Dame, the receiver position has been so interesting to me because we've obviously had some down years recently, but there was a stretch there, honestly, starting with Jeff Samardzija, where every single year Notre Dame had an elite wide receiver one. They didn't always have that wide receiver two. They did some years, but not every year. And then obviously that fell flat pretty recently, but hopefully they can get that back on track soon.
Yeah, and there was this article that Pete Thamel did. He did an interview with Brian Kelly when he was still at Notre Dame, and it was one of those gap closing articles, right? Like, can they get this? Can they take the jump? And obviously, like, I mean, he didn't do anything to really close the gap. He put Notre Dame in a better position than he left than when he arrived, but he didn't do what he said. He said one of the big takeaways from the article, and I wonder if he regrets it now, but he said, we need Will Fuller and Michael Floyd on the same team. And Notre Dame has never had that. They've never had that. And I would say right now they don't have that. And that's, I think, is where they're the furthest away, right? Like they need Tobias Merriweather and Braylon James and whatever, like that's what they need. Like those guys, and like oh my, because then all of a sudden because that's how, like, if you look at Notre Dame's defense, even last year, right? Look what they did against the top receivers they faced. Those guys didn't do much against Notre Dame. And I wouldn't even say, like, obviously Benjamin Morrison ended up being a great player, but it wasn't like Benjamin Morrison was like shadowing these guys the whole time or whatever. Tariq Bracy obviously covered a lot of really good slots, but as a whole, they were able to shut down, because you can scheme around to shut down one guy, but when you have two guys, then it becomes incredibly difficult. I mean, two or three guys, and then all of a sudden you got tons of problems, right? And that's where kind of like Notre Dame had that guy last year, Michael Mayer. Right? Michael Mayer was that guy, but they never had the receiver to go with him. Right. And that was one of the things that even where 2019 was weirdly, like, you could kind of like Voltron Notre Dame's teams together and say, like, man, if you had 2019 Chase Claypool and then you had 2019 Cole Kmet and you put them on that 2018 team, and then that's kind of like where they're at there, then it's like, oh, well, that's like two other problems that, like, Clemson would have had to deal with in that college football playoff. They didn't have to in that game.
All right, last question here before we let you go. All this talk, it all goes back to recruiting. You need to be able to recruit the top end guys year in and year out so you could stack depth. And if you do miss, you've got another guy, hopefully another top recruit who can come in and then hopefully fill that void. And since Marcus Freeman has come on board, he's really supercharged the Notre Dame recruiting operation. But if you look at the rankings, there's still pretty clearly a gap between Notre Dame and some of the top teams. Now, the blue chip ratio, it's something you mentioned already. It's a good way to quantify how close Notre Dame is getting to the top. The blue chip ratio is the amount of 4- and 5-star prospects you sign over a 4-year span, if I have that correct. Yeah. So looking at it, the blue chip ratio for Notre Dame, how close is their recruiting operation to getting to a national championship level so that they can actually stockpiling the amount of talent that they need?
I mean, a lot closer, right? So the lowest blue chip ratio, first of all, shout out to Bud Elliott, who created it when he was at SB Nation. Now he's at 24/7 Sports. He's the guy who created this. And it's basically like, every recent year national championship is like 50% is like the cutoff, right? Where you have to win a national championship. So like half of your guys got to be 4 or 5 stars. But really, college football playoff era, 61% is the lowest, and that's that 2016 Clemson team, right? That's the lowest.
Yeah, they're like the exception of the rule in all of this.
But,
and again, they had Deshaun Watson and Mike Williams. Yeah. So.
Yeah. And, 3 future first-round picks on the defensive line. They were pretty loaded, right?
Yeah.
But so Notre Dame right now is at 67.8%. So, I mean, that's better. During most of that Brian Kelly, 5-year run, they were like high 50s, really, right? That's kind of where they're at. So you're like, wow, they're up, basically like 10% from where they were. They're moving in the right direction. Where they've been the last couple of years is like around 80%, like high 70s, low 80s. That's where they've been the last couple of years. That's exactly where you want to be, because that's where Georgia, Alabama, Ohio State, that's where those guys are. So, but the thing is you have to do that over a 4-year span. You have to do that over 4 years. So now, and then the problem is that you look at most of the guys with the highest ceiling and the most raw talent on the team for Notre Dame right now are freshmen and sophomores, right? Those, it's not a coincidence. Those are the guys that they were like the highest ranked guys. They signed more in these last 2 classes, right? These last 2 Marcus Freeman classes. So they need those guys to get older and be like, juniors and seniors, 3rd and 4th year, 5th year guys. And that's where they kind of need it to be. And then also have these other young guys. So then when you get a Benjamin Morrison who ends up being like a star as a freshman, then that's just adding to what you already kind of have. Right. And so I would say they're way closer than they are, but the 67.8% blue chip ratio, it's a little misleading because most of it is concentrated in the last 2 classes.
Yeah, those guys aren't playing yet, or at least a lot of them.
Yeah. And so even this year, right, where you look at it, so I'm just pick a guy like Josh Burnham, for example, right? Josh Burnham, I think, has a chance. I really like what I saw from him in the open practice when I went on April 1st. He's making the transition from being a linebacker in high school to play quarterback in high school, and now he's a defensive end. He's put on a lot of weight, showed a lot of good progress. he might not be in the rotation this year. Like he's gonna be he could be, and he might end up being a player, but there's a greater chance that he is going to be a bigger time player next year. So even if he plays this year, he might just be like just a guy who helps or whatever, right? So you look at it, the way I look at it, this team for Notre Dame, and even though they have like this high percentage of blue chips, that's pretty good, right? And then I think they'll probably get over 70%, over the next year. But they're going to need all these guys from the 2022 class to really be like dudes in year 3 and take that jump in year 3, which is what happened in 2018 for Notre Dame. They had a ton of guys who were sophomores and second-year players on that 2017 team who were good players. They were good contributors, like Khalid Kareem, Julian Aquara, right? All those type of guys. And then they took a next step the next year, right? And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, well, I mean, Julian Aquara is like, now is one of the best pass rushers in college football, right? Like, and that's kind of where they need to be. So I think they're getting closer. They're certainly improving. I mean, they still need to land more top 50 guys. They still need to land more 5-star kids. Obviously not landing Peyton Bowen, the Keon Keeleys, like those are big, significant losses, right? Those are kind of game changers, right? Dante Moores, et cetera. Those are game changers. But what they're doing in building the roster, they're improving the roster. They're getting it closer to a championship level, but they aren't there yet. This team right now doesn't have, I don't believe, what it takes to actually be like a contender. They have, they could, if enough of these young guys kind of take big jumps, they could get to like, have a chance to be in the college football playoff, but not win it.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think, as good as Marcus Freeman has been on the recruiting trail, it took Georgia years at recruiting at the highest level before they got to where they're at. But Jamie, this has been great, man. You can listen to him on his podcast, Hit and Hustle, with another friend of the program, Greg Flamung. And you can check out his written work on irishsportsdaily.com. There's plenty of great stuff there. I mean, we went 30 plus minutes on like 2 articles. So go check out his work. And Jamie, I really appreciate your time and insight. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
That's going to do it for me today. Thanks again to Jamie, and thank you for making this your first listen of the day. For all the everydayers out there, remember to tune into tomorrow's episode for the latest updates out of Notre Dame spring practice. And on the way out, remember to subscribe to the show on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts, and give us a follow on Twitter at Locked On Irish, on Instagram at Locked On Irish Pod, and my personal Twitter account at Tyler Wojciak. That's at Tyler, Wojciak. I'll see you guys tomorrow.